In this short video, I'm going to show you how to create a 2D platform movement controller for this version of Unity. I specified it's this version of Unity because in older versions, this input system is not the default, and there was an older version called the input manager that's the default. Now, the difference between the two is quite large. The input manager uses a lot of if statements, and the input system uses a more subscription-based version. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, that's okay. But the important thing to know is that the input system kind of like puts it into two separate scripts, which can be a little odd. So just like stay with me in the video, and it'll hopefully all make sense. Now, I already had Visual Studio loaded earlier, so I don't want to have to wait for that. But when you guys do it, it's going to take some time, obviously. So since this is a video, you can pause, fast forward, rewind, slow down, whatever you need, whenever something is going too fast. Anyways, let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is make a little player and a little area for them to move around in. So I'm going to do plus, 2D object, sprites, capsule for my player. And then I'm going to do plus, 2D object, sprites, square for my ground. And then I'm going to resize it. I'm holding down control, by the way, to make it snap like this. And then on the ground, I'm going to add a box collider 2D, which will give this thing collision with other collider 2Ds. Now, on my player, I could give it a capsule collider 2D, but like, you don't always want the hitboxes to be totally accurate, especially because he might like start like falling over and stuff like that. So we're going to give it a box collider 2D. So now, if I play the game, one more thing actually that my capsule guy needs is a rigid body 2D, which is what gives it physics. There are so many components in Unity. If we just look at the physics one for now, we got box collider, capsule collider, circle collider. We've got the rigid body. We've got what is this? Target joint, wheel joint, just a bunch of random stuff. Recommend playing around with it and just seeing what you can find, play around with. Actually, we're ready to just start making the script now. So my assets down here, I'm going to right click and then click create and then click mono behavior script. This is what lets you create scripts that add behaviors to objects or custom data or whatever. This is going to be called platformer movement. Now, I did not put any spaces in there. Do not ever put spaces in your script name because it'll break everything. I'll show you why in a second. I'm going to open the script up. Oh, after it reloads. And then, like I said, I already signed into Visual Studio and everything, so I'm just going to move the window over once it's ready. Now, Unity checks to make sure that this name, Unity checks to make sure that this name of your script matches the file name exactly. And this name can't have spaces in it, otherwise it breaks everything, which is why I said don't put any spaces in the file name. Now, if this is your first script, it's also important to know that naming convention states that it should all be one word, and the first letter of each new word, including the first word, should be capitalized. So it's platformer movement with a capital P and a capital M. If I lowercase the p, it would actually yell at me. It would say, naming rule violation. Now these rules don't just exist for the heck of it. They exist so that people can look at your code and kind of get a general understanding of what it means and what it does without actually having to look at it in too much detail. Like if you have a capital letter, you know that's the name of a script, probably. I'm not going to have GitHub Copilot turned on for mine because I don't want to get in the way of the lesson, but you can have it turned on if you link your GitHub account. It might make it easier to follow along because it'll probably auto-predict most of the things we're going to do in this video. So the first thing I'm going to do is above void start, I'm going to make two variables. Now, at some point, I'm going to actually publish the variables lesson once IT gives me the OK on my website. But if you don't know, what a variable is it lets you store data and sometimes change that data based on whatever type of data you want to store. For example, I want the user to be able to change the speed and the jump height for the player. So I'm going to make two variables for that, one for the speed and one for the jump height. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make those variables floats. A float will let the user change it as like a number. So watch. we make a public float and call it speed, and then go back to Unity. Give it a sec to load, obviously. I'm not going to edit this in post, so you don't have to just sit here and wait or skip through. It'll go quicker the next time, I think. Okay, so the capsule has the sprite render, box collider 2D, rigid body 2D. Let's actually drag on. So if I take this platformer movement script that I made, I can actually drag it on and give it the script. And you'll see that the other scripts, they had settings. Like box collider has all these settings, rigid body has all these settings. By creating a public float called speed, we created a setting for the platformer movement script. So right now the speed is set to 0, that's the default. If you want to set a default, you can say equals and then some number, like 5 for example, that'd give it a default. Let's set it to 5 to see what happens. Now, we've added the script, but we haven't actually done anything with the speed variable yet, so it's not going to just magically work. But while we're at it, let's go add a public float for the jump height. Notice I didn't turn on Copilot, but it's still like auto-predicting stuff. That's the Visual Studio built-in, not AI-based prediction thing. I'm going to save this, go back to Unity, and you'll notice that there's 2 settings now, speed and jump height. Now, next thing I'm going to do is our script needs access to one of our components. What we're going to do is we're going to say, we want this script to be able to access our rigid body, because our rigid body controls our physics, and we want to tell it move to the left or move to the right using the physics. So we're going to, in here, we're going to say public rigid body 2D, RB2D, and then we're going to save, and then go back to Unity. Again, I'm going kind of fast because I know that you can just pause the video whenever you feel like it. So the floats let us pick a number, because that was the second word here, float, public float. The second word here is rigid body 2D, which that lets us pick a rigid body. We could drag in the rigid body of any object. Let's just drag in the rigid body of our own object. So I have all 3 settings filled in. We're going to start setting this up a little bit more. So in our void, actually, let's go back to Unity real quick. So this is where the input system is going to come in. We're going to click Add Component and type in Input and click on the one that says Player Input. Now the Unity system separates the input part of the movement from the actual what happens when you press the button part of the movement. So the player input component handles all of that, because that gives us controller support, local multiplayer support, stuff like that. You'll notice that when we do our platform movement script for this video, not a single part of what we do is actually going to read input. It's just going to respond to the input that's already been read. So we have both these components now. I'm going to minimize my rigid body 2D just to simplify the look of things here. Let me transform, why not? So let's go ahead and write some more of our script. So we're going to create 2 public voids. Underneath void update, we're going to say public void move. And it wants us to do animator move because it thinks it's what we want. It's not what we want. We're going to have parentheses and curly brackets, and then a public void jump. Now, what is a public void? This is what's called a function or a method. Basically, we can put a piece of code, or as many pieces of code as we want, inside of these curly brackets, and it will be grouped together. And some voids are special. Like void update, whatever code you put in here is going to run every single frame. And then we have void start. Whatever code you put in here is going to run once at the very beginning of our game. So void start is very good for initializing or setting things up. And void update is very good for doing things that need to happen over and over again, like updating your player's position or their movement or checking for the player's health, and then if the health is less than 0, make the player die, or whatever. Now, in our void move, what we're going to do is we're going to add one little thing inside these parentheses called a parameter. That parameter is going to tell us what we were doing with the input device. So inside the parentheses, you have to type in input action dot callback context CTX. Now, input action dot callback context is a type. In this case, it's a struct. This means that it stores a bunch of data that we can use. And then CTX is the name or the identifier. That's how we refer to this specific callback context, so we can actually get the information from it. Our void jump is going to need that as well. So I'm going to save this and go back to Unity again. Now check this out. In my player input component, behavior is currently set to send messages. I'm going to change it to invoke Unity events. And then click on events, and then click on player. You'll see a bunch of different ones here. Move, look, attack, interact, crouch, jump, previous, next, and sprint. These are all potential input actions you can respond to. You could actually add more if you wanted to. You don't have to follow along this part. But if I take my input system actions object and I double click it to open it up, you can see move, look, attack, interact, crouch, jump, previous, next, and sprint. This is where it's getting that list from. You can add or remove anything from this list that you want from your game. Just be careful. Back to our player. I'm going to open up events, open up player. You'll notice that it says callback context. It matches the type we talked about earlier, which is good. So under move, we're going to click plus, and then we're going to drag in our platform movement script into the none object spot, and then change it from no function to player movement, platformer movement, move. And then on the jump one, we're going to click plus, and then again, we're going to drag in our platformer movement script, and then click platformer movement, jump. So we're now using both of these methods or functions, and they're both tied to the correct inputs. Now that we've done that, we're going to go back to our script, and we're going to hopefully finish writing it. So in our move script, what we want to do is we're actually going to record the user's current, like how much they're moving the stick, and I'll show you why. So in our movement script, here's an example of what you might want to do. We need to get our rigid body, and we need to apply a velocity to it. So in our move function here, what we could do is say rb2d.linear velocity x equals, let's just say -1, for example. Let's say anytime we press the button, we want it to move left, which would be -1. This move function actually doesn't activate every frame while you're pressing the stick. It only activates when it changes. So as soon as I move the stick the first time, and as soon as I release the stick, which is not good. We want it to move the player every frame while they're holding the button. So what we're going to do is, underneath our public rigid body 2D RB2D, we're going to make a private float called _movement. Now, this is private instead of public because we don't want this to show up in the Unity inspector. I'm going to save this and then go back to Unity. Again, going fast because you can pause and rewind and everything. Notice that it didn't show up here underneath our RB2D thing. Making it private means we can't see it. And the reason we want that is because this variable is going to be set entirely within the script. We don't want the user to be able to customize that at all because it would make no sense. This is not some sort of setting. This is just keeping track of what we're already doing. So in our void move, what we're going to do is we're going to say _movement equals CTX dot read value, and then in angle brackets, we're going to type in vector2, and then parentheses, and then a semicolon. Oh, and then we're going to say .x. So this is a really weird and confusing line here. What this says is this number that we're keeping track of, every time we change every time we move the left stick or whatever button you're using to move around, we're going to read that value as a vector 2, which means a vector 2 is just an x and a y. So what is the x and what is the y of the stick? So how far are you doing it horizontally and how far are you doing it vertically? This is going to save it into this movement variable. And then in our void update, we're going to say rb2d dot linear velocity x equals underscore movement. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to actually apply that variable to our current linear velocity on the x-axis. I went ahead and I saved the script. I'm going to go back to Unity now because I want to finish up soon. And let's play the game and see what happens. If I press A or D, you'll see the player moves, albeit very slowly. We can change the speed, and we'll notice that actually nothing happens because we forgot to use it. So let's go back to the script here real quick. So we say movement equals ctx.readValue vector2.x. Let's say times speed. And actually, I want to be a little bit more pedantic. I want to rename it to move speed. So I'm going to right-click the speed variable here and then click rename and then call it move speed. Because there's other things that are speed related, right? Like if you had a dash, it might be a dash speed. So always just be specific. Although you will notice that renaming the variable did reset the value. It's a very good thing to know. Let's play it now. And now you'll see that the player moves a lot quicker. We can actually change this value while the game is running. But note that anytime you stop the game, the value will get reset. Just keep that in mind. Let's add a jump now. In our void jump, we're going to say, this is a little bit easier, rb2d dot add force, and then in parentheses. Actually, no. Let's just say, so I'll tell you why not. So we could do, there's two options here. We could say add force, and then say vector2.up times jump height. The reason we wouldn't want to do this one is because this will add force to our current velocity. So if we're falling at we'll say 100 meters a second and we jump, nothing's going to happen. We're not going to actually jump at all because the 100 meters a second that we're already falling is just going to completely overpower any jump that we have because we're adding to it. What we want to do is just completely reset your y velocity so that no matter how fast you're falling, you'll actually get the jump. So we're going to say rb2d dot linear velocity y equals jump height. And now we're going to go back to Unity. And we're going to play the game. And in a second, any second now. Oh my goodness. We can now press the space bar to jump. And even if we're falling a lot, it'll get our jump, verticality will get reset. Notice the game's kind of really floaty, not really in a good way. You can go in the rigid body 2D and you can tweak a bunch of settings. You might want to take your gravity scale and make it way higher, and then make your jump height way higher. And now it's a little snappier. Something definitely to play around with is all of these speed values and gravity and stuff. This is already feeling a lot better. But again, all these values are going to get reset when the game changes, so make sure you, or when you stop the game, I mean. So make sure you memorize them. I set the gravity scale to 5, the move speed to 10, jump height to 15. I'm going to stop the game now, so let's head back. 5, 10, 10, 15. Okay. I lied. There's one more thing I have to do in the script. Two more things, actually. The jump here is weird. Remember how I said the move doesn't get called every frame while you're pressing the button? It only gets called when you start moving in a direction, or you start moving the stick in a direction, and when you change that direction. Jump is similar. This function's actually going to get called when you both press the button and release it, which we don't want. We only want it to happen when you press the button. Trust me, it has a weird behavior if you don't. So we're going to add into here something called an if statement. An if statement lets us run code conditionally. We're going to say only run this line of code if something is true. And that thing we want to say is only run the code if we actually just press the button, not released it. So here we're going to say if ctx, because that's where we get the input context, dot read value, and angle brackets float, and then parentheses, is equal to 1. And then I'm going to add curly brackets and move this inside the curly brackets. Again, I'm going a little quick right now. Let me explain this just for a second. I'm holding down Alt right now. And by holding down Alt, you can move entire lines of code or entire functions of code at once. So I'm selecting this, or even just clicking on the line, and holding down Alt and pressing up. It's a pretty neat trick. So now our code says only actually apply the linear velocity to our jump height, or jump height to our linear velocity, if 1. Now 1 means you're pressing the button, 0 means you're releasing the button. Let's test it out real quick. You never want to assume your changes are going to work. Just good rule of thumb. You know what they say about assuming, blah, blah, blah. Anyways, we'll see the button works now only when we press it, not when we release it. Now, this video is not going to cover how to only make sure your player gets one jump and not infinite like this, because that's actually a whole other can of worms. If you're interested, look into something called a box cast. A box cast basically lets you draw an invisible box under the player's feet and see if there's anything there. If there's something there, you're on the ground. If there's nothing there, you're in the air. I'm not going to touch it in this video because that's going to take a whole other thing. But it's called a box cast if you want. There's a good tutorial online that has a picture of Mario or whatever in it. I recommend watching that one. Last thing I'm going to do is something just to make this code a little cleaner. Now, we had to set the move speed and the jump height because the player is going to want to customize these two things to their liking. But the RB2D is actually something that should be the same every time. For every player, it should just be the attached rigid body. That's an extra little bit of setup that's just going to annoy whoever's actually setting the script up, whether it's you or a teammate or something like that. So we're going to streamline this last variable here. Instead of making RB2D public, we're going to make it private so it doesn't show up in the inspector. And then in our void start, we're going to say RB2D equals get component rigid body 2D. This is going to automatically grab the rigid body from our object using this function instead of having us manually do it. So I'm going to switch back over to Unity now. You'll see since I made the variable private, it's gone. And if I play the game, you'll notice that it still has access to the rigid body. It's still allowing us to move and do everything we could before, but it just made the setup for the user just that much simpler. Now, sometimes you want to actually debug a value of a private variable. Like if it's not working, I want to see why. If you click this ... button up here, you can switch from normal mode to debug mode, and then you can see the value of private variables. You can't change them because that still defeats the whole purpose. If I play the game now, you can see the current value of these variables. You can see the capsule collider got set to RB2D. Movement 0 because I'm not pressing any buttons right now. But as soon as I start pressing buttons, it'll be updated properly. Just don't forget to turn it back when you're not using it. That's pretty much it for the video. One more very, very, very quick thing I'm going to say is that in void start here, I said that start happens at the very beginning of the game only once, and it's good for setup. That's true. There's actually a function that happens even before start called awake. And anytime you're getting a component from an object, you should put it in awake. Just because it happens a little bit earlier than start, it's the very, very, very first thing to happen. And you just always want to make sure that you're properly getting that variable. So back to Unity. Before I end the video, again, got to test the game. Got to make sure it actually works. One final test. We can move around. We can jump. Just like in the intro project, you want to attach your camera to your player and child it by dragging it onto it. You can. If the camera is childed to the capsule, which I should rename to player, then whatever happens to the player will happen to the camera. Like, watch. Now it follows along, right? But if I tip over, the same thing will happen. So you might want to end up making your own camera controller script that'll follow the player on its own, but only with position and not with rotation. Another thing you can do is go to your player's rigid body 2D settings, and then go to constraints, and then go to freeze rotation Z. This way it can't rotate along the Z axis. This is something you should be doing anyways, but the camera script is also something you should be doing, because then you can make it drag behind the player a little bit. It'll make people a little bit nauseous if the camera just directly follows the player. Another video will cover camera movement in the future. You could also just search it up online. I'm sure there's some good resources for that. But that is everything in the video. Again, if you're curious about making it so you can only jump once, it's called a box cast. Look it up. That's everything. Thanks for watching.